What would you do if the idea you built in silence late at night, at a kitchen table scattered with bills and your father's pill organizer, was suddenly announced on stage under someone else's name? This is not the story of a CEO with a perfect suit. It is the story of Claire Whitman, a secretary who had spent her life keeping order in other people's chaos. She carried grocery lists, caregiving routines, and a quiet dream to honor her late mother's work, feeding neighbors by building a program called Neighbor's Table. But when her plan was unveiled at a glittering gala in Chicago, it wasn't Claire's name. The crowd applauded. It was Ethan Harrington's, the billionaire heir to a company built on control. That night, under the chandeliers, Claire faced a choice: remain invisible, or risk everything to speak. Would her voice be swallowed by power, or could it turn the room still? Could dignity be defended against $22 billion and the habits of an empire? And what happens when apology becomes policy, and policy becomes culture? Stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss this extraordinary journey, because this story might just remind you that recognition is not charity, it is justice. A winter gala glowed over Lake Michigan, its lights shimmering across the icy water, as if the whole city had gathered to watch itself sparkle. Inside the glass towers of Chicago's Loop, the headquarters of Harrington and Cole Holdings had been transformed into a ballroom of silver linens, polished glasses, and voices that hummed with expectation. The January wind pressed against the tall windows, but inside there was warmth, candlelight, and the promise of another year of corporate benevolence. Claire Whitman stood near the back of the hall, holding a small program booklet in her hands. She was not a guest of honor, not one of the donors whose names were printed in bold on the evening's agenda. She was an executive secretary, accustomed to working behind the scenes, making sure calendars aligned, speeches arrived on time, and no one missed their flight. Tonight she was here out of obligation, not out of belonging. Her navy dress was simple, her shoes practical, her posture careful. She did not expect the night to hold her name at all. At the front of the room, Ethan Harrington moved with the confidence of a man who had never questioned whether the spotlight belonged to him. At 45, heir to a third-generation empire, he wore power like a tailored suit. His words, smooth and practiced, carried easily through the microphones. Donors leaned forward, cameras caught every angle. The board members, seated in their reserved places, nodded with practiced seriousness. Ethan was not only their CEO, he was their symbol of continuity, of strength, of relentless forward motion. Claire listened politely, her eyes moving across the room, until a single phrase reached her and froze her where she stood: Neighbor's Table. The words hit her chest with the force of recognition, as if someone had spoken her late mother's name aloud. Her breath caught. She stared at the screen behind him, at the slides now lighting up the hall. A community food program, designed to serve small-town groceries and church pantries, woven into the company's philanthropic image. The layout was hers, every line, every detail, down to the placement of the recipe card motif she had taken from her mother's handwriting. For a moment, the noise of the gala faded. She was not in Chicago's glittering headquarters. She was back in her apartment kitchen, the smell of a cooling casserole still in the air, her father's pill organizer open on the table beside her laptop. She remembered the way she had spread her notes, shaping them into a plan that might honor her mother's pantry work while addressing the food desserts she had read about in Midwest towns. Hours of quiet effort, typed in the glow of a single lamp. All of it was here now. Under Ethan Harrington's name? The applause swelled. Donors clapped warmly. Cameras flashed. Ethan smiled with the ease of someone who believed the moment was his. But Claire's private grief rose in her throat, a heartbeat that refused to stay silent. She looked down at the program booklet in her hands, at her own neat notes scribbled in the margin. For years she had been the invisible one, the person who kept the machine moving without expecting to be seen. Yet now, as she stood in that ballroom filled with applause for her stolen work, invisibility felt like betrayal. She straightened. The decision came quietly, but it filled her body with a steadiness she had not known she carried. Years of silent competence lifted her chin. Without rushing, without making a scene, she began to move forward. The click of her modest heels against the floor sounded louder than she expected. Heads turned, a hush rippled across the tables as people realized someone was breaking the script. Ethan's voice faltered for the briefest second as he noticed her approach. The cameras adjusted, curious. Donors exchanged looks. The board chair, Margaret Cole, leaned forward in her seat. Claire walked until she stood near the front, her navy dress playing against the shimmer of evening gowns and tuxedos. She did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. She simply spoke. Her words were steady, composed, unmistakable. She named herself as the author of Neighbor's Table. She explained that the program had been drafted in her apartment kitchen, drawn from her family's history and developed through her own research. She stated that she had submitted the plan through official channels months before, and she let the weight of her truth rest in the air, refusing to be brushed aside. The room stilled. Applause had died away, replaced by silence that felt louder than any cheer. On the live stream, her name was caught, spoken clearly enough that thousands watching from their homes or offices now knew it. Donors, once focused on Ethan's words, now turned their attention to her. Board members shifted in their chairs, their expressions unreadable. The cameras did not leave her face. For Claire, the moment stretched like an endless corridor. She felt her father's quiet strength at her back, her mother's recipe cards in her hands, and the cold air of January pressing against the glass walls. She did not know what would come next. She only knew she had stepped forward, and there was no going back. The gala did not end in applause. It ended in held breath. Margaret Cole's voice carried softly across the room, requesting that all documentation be reviewed. Ethan's expression tightened, but he said nothing. Outside, the wind off the lake cut colder than before, rattling the tall windows. Inside, nothing was settled. The night had shifted, and the story would not return to normal. Before the glare of cameras and the silence of a stunned ballroom, there were grocery lists, insurance copay receipts, and evenings where a daughter steadied a shaking hand with one palm while typing with the other. Claire Whitman's life was measured in such details, small and ordinary, but heavy in their constancy. At 36, Claire had learned to live with quiet steadiness. She had been born in a small town in the Midwest, the daughter of a man who ran a hardware store and a woman who organized food drives from the basement of their church. Her path was not marked by ivy-covered universities or internships abroad. It was community college classes, part-time jobs, and the slow climb from local clerical work to the corporate floors of Chicago. Each rung of the ladder had been steady, earned, and often unseen. By the time she arrived at Harrington and Cole Holdings, she was already practiced in invisibility. In the corporate towers overlooking Lake Michigan, Claire became what executives most valued: reliable. Her days were a long string of schedules, reminders, calls taken and redirected. If she disappeared, the office machinery would falter. But because she never did, few noticed she was there at all. Her discretion was not only a skill, it was a shield. She knew birthdays, travel preferences, unspoken tensions between board members. She kept them to herself. That trust made her indispensable, but it also made her anonymous. Home was a different rhythm. The walk-up apartment in Chicago creaked with age, its heat unreliable in the winter winds. Her father lived there with her, a widower facing early-onset Parkinson's. The disease had crept in slowly, first a slight tremor in his hand, then the difficulty of buttoning shirts, then the pauses in speech that stretched too long. Claire organized his pillboxes with the same discipline she brought to work, morning and night. She counted the tablets, brewed tea, and adjusted the old space heater so the chill would not reach him. Their life was built on routines so careful that missing one could bring chaos. Her mother had been the warmth of the household. Before cancer claimed her, she had filled church basements with shelves of canned goods and recipes scrawled on index cards. She believed food was never just food, it was dignity. For Claire, those cards became heirlooms. She kept them in a worn box by her desk at home. When she missed her mother most, She would lift the lid, smell the faint trace of spice still clinging to the paper, and feel steadied. It was from that box that Neighbor's Table was born, not as a corporate initiative, but as a daughter's attempt to carry something forward on nights when her father slept. She spread papers across the kitchen table, her mother's recipe cards, USDA reports on food desserts, distribution cost analyses pulled from public data. She built spreadsheets, charts, and drafts of proposals. She imagined company trucks delivering not only profit, but nourishment. She saw possibilities where others saw expense. Hope became cells in Excel. Late nights became plans that felt almost real. At Harrington and Cole, executives spoke about quarterly growth and brand reputation. Claire listened, quietly, and thought of shelves in towns where grocery stores had closed. She saw the gap between the gleaming headquarters with its catered lunches and the long, cold distribution runs that drivers endured across Indiana highways. She straddled both worlds, the polished corporate floors where decisions were made and the working-class spaces where those decisions landed. Most executives only knew one of those places. Claire knew both. Believing in the system, she did what she thought was right. She submitted her drafts through the internal portals, attached them to project folders, and forwarded them to supervisors. She expected a note, a question, some recognition that the work was hers. Instead, the drafts rose without her. They were polished by others, refined in language, smoothed into slides. Each time they came back to her inbox, they carried fewer fingerprints of their origin. The ideas grew sharper, but her name faded until it was not there at all. She told herself it didn't matter, that what mattered was the program existing, not who authored it. Yet the quiet harm grew heavier each time she saw a version further from her kitchen table. The more professional the proposal became, the less trace of her remained. It was as if invisibility were not only her role, but her destiny. That realization did not come with shock. It came with a slow, accumulating ache, like carrying a bag whose weight increases grain by grain. Still, she persisted. She saved each version, marked each date, not out of suspicion, but out of habit, the same way she kept receipts or logged her father's medical notes. Evidence was comfort. Timestamps steadied her, even when no one else noticed. One afternoon, as winter pressed harder against the city, a new entry appeared on her calendar, gala run of show. She opened the file, expecting logistics. Instead, she saw her idea, dressed in corporate colors, rehearsed for a stage she had not been invited to step on. Her program was alive without her. The silence that had once been her safety now cut like betrayal. She closed her laptop gently. On the table beside her, her father's hand trembled as he lifted a mug of tea. She steadied it with one hand while staring at the screen with the other. The choice had not yet formed, but something in her posture shifted. She began gathering the drafts, the emails, the timestamps, placing them in a folder that grew heavier with each printout. She did not know if she would use them. She only knew she could no longer pretend the system would name her. The next part of her story was already taking shape, though she could not see its end. All she could see was the cold ink of the gala schedule, and the certainty that her mother's recipe cards deserved better than silence. Sometimes erasure is a soft thing. It does not come with raised voices or slammed doors. It comes as a line edited out, a name trimmed from a page, a thank you spoken vaguely into the air. At first it feels harmless, almost reasonable, but when it repeats, when it gathers, the soft thing begins to bruise. Claire Whitman noticed the pattern in pieces. The first time was with her pilot budget for Neighbor's Table. She had worked through numbers late one night, spreading receipts and county data across her kitchen table. She calculated the costs of sourcing produce from nearby farms, the savings from using half-filled distribution trucks already heading through rural towns. It was careful, plain math. Weeks later, she saw the figures again in a leadership deck formatted, branded, stripped of her initials at the bottom. It was not theft in the dramatic sense. It was a quiet lifting, the kind of borrowing that left no fingerprints. Then her outreach list appeared in another document. She had spent weekends compiling it, calling churches and food pantries her mother once knew, confirming addresses, asking which days their shelves were most empty. She remembered the hesitant voices on the other end of the line, the gratitude when someone cared enough to ask. In the new version, her work was condensed into bullet points under a heading called Community Stakeholders. No mention of the hours of calls, no echo of the stories she had heard, just neat lines on a slide, delivered upward. The story of her mother's pantry became the hardest to swallow. She had written it as an introduction, a way to ground the program in real lives. Her mother, who had organized food drives in church basements, believed no neighbors should go to bed hungry. In the polished presentation, that memory was retold as a brand anecdote, a warm opener for donors. Her mother's handwriting, once sacred to Claire, was reduced to marketing copy. At first, Claire told herself she was overreacting. Corporate work was a team effort. Ideas passed through many hands. But when she finally voiced a hesitation, CFO Thomas Riggs gave her a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Support staff don't originate," he said, almost kindly. "They enable, don't confuse the two." His tone suggested advice, but the words landed like dismissal. In that moment, Claire understood something larger than her own pain. This was not about her. It was about a habit, a culture where credit flowed only one way upward. She did not shout. She did not protest in hallways. Instead, she began to collect. She printed drafts and tucked them into folders. She saved email threads with timestamps highlighted. She noted when her files were uploaded, who forwarded them, and how the titles shifted each time. She was methodical, not vindictive, like her careful notes on her father's medication. This was a kind of record-keeping that steadied her. If she could not be seen, at least she would not be erased completely. The final blow arrived in a rehearsal script. It was sent out weeks before the gala, a tidy outline of who would speak, what slides would display, which phrases donors might find most inspiring. Claire scrolled through, her eyes searching. The program was there, alive and polished, but all staff credits were gone. No mention of contributors, no hint of origin. Even the recipe card motif, her mother's index cards, scanned and softened in color, was listed as stage dressing. Her private memories had become a prop in someone else's performance. She sat back in her chair, the script glowing on her screen, and let the quiet of her apartment wrap around her. The refrigerator hummed, the radiator clanged once, then went still. At the kitchen table, her father stirred his tea slowly, his hand trembling as he lifted the spoon. Claire steadied the cup with one hand, just as she had done countless times, while her other hand stayed frozen on the mouse. The neatness of the script, the way everything looked perfect without her, was what broke something inside her. The theft was not loud. It was complete. That night she opened the heavy folder she had been filling with drafts and printouts. She laid each piece across the table, early sketches in pencil, spreadsheets with dates in the corner, emails with her name in the sender line, the table filled with evidence of months of work, small but undeniable. She did not arrange them for show. She arranged them for clarity, to remind herself she was not imagining it. Each page was proof that her effort had existed before it was smoothed into anonymity. She practiced breathing more than speaking. Inhale, steady, exhale, steady. She had never been someone who raised her voice in meetings, never the person to interrupt. But as she looked at the papers spread before her, she knew silence was becoming a kind of consent, and she could no longer bear that weight. Her father sipped his tea, unaware of the storm gathering in her chest. He looked at her with the softness that came from decades of trust, and she felt her resolve harden. If the moment came, if there was an opening, she would speak, not for revenge, not for glory, for truth, and for her mother's recipe cards, and for every quiet hour that deserved not to be erased. The decision was not dramatic. It was steady, like the way she folded each paper back into the folder, pressed the edges flat, and placed it neatly on the table. Outside, the winter wind rattled the window frame. Inside, Claire Whitman sat with her tea cooling beside her, and prepared herself for a moment that had not yet arrived, but surely would. A woman in the back of a grand room chooses to be visible. That is the whole story, and also the beginning of every other story. Claire Whitman rose from her seat as the microphone passed down the row for questions. The gala's program had run long, speeches polished, applause frequent. People were settling into the rhythm of praise and performance when her movement caught the air. For years she had trained herself to blend into corners, to stay quiet while others filled the space. Now, as she stood, her simple navy dress seemed to draw more attention than the sequins and tuxedos surrounding her. Her voice carried without trembling. "Neighbor's Table," she said clearly, naming the program that had just been celebrated as a hallmark of corporate vision. Heads turned, a few brows furrowed. Some guests assumed she was asking a question, but her tone was not that of curiosity. It was the steadiness of authorship. She spoke without hurry. She named the origin. She explained that she had drafted the plan herself, building it from evenings in her apartment kitchen, from data she collected, from memories of her mother's pantry cards. She cited dates, submission times, file versions, email attachments. She described how the idea had risen through channels, each version sharper but further from her name. She did not accuse, she documented, calm, factual, undeniable. The crowd shifted. What had been a spectacle of generosity turned into something more fragile. The clink of glasses stopped. The murmurs quieted. Attention that had been pointed toward the stage now rested fully on her. She did not flinch. She let silence work for her. The way silence had always been her burden. Tonight, it became her ally. At the front of the room, Margaret Cole, the board chair, leaned back slightly. At 68, she had seen hundreds of meetings, dozens of confrontations, countless rehearsed moments of control. Her gaze was sharp, unblinking, the kind that did not miss small truths. She watched Claire the way a seasoned judge watches a witness, not only hearing words, but measuring the weight behind them. Ethan Harrington stood on stage, hands folded loosely at the podium. For once his smile faltered. He measured the moment against the persona he had spent decades building, the visionary CEO, the polished heir, the man who never doubted his place. Claire's words pressed against that image like water finding cracks in stone. He could not laugh it off without looking cruel. He could not deny it without risking evidence. His silence became its own confession. Claire continued. She offered to furnish documentation, to hand over time-stamped drafts and email records. Her tone was calm, professional, the way she might have delivered a calendar update in the office. But here, in the grand ballroom, with chandeliers casting light across 100 faces, the same calmness carried power. People leaned in. They realized this was not a disruption. It was a claim. On social feeds, phones were already lifted. A clip of her standing, speaking evenly, began to circulate with captions like "Secretary confronts," "CEO at gala," and "Who really built neighbor's table." The narrative, once tightly controlled, now scattered into the digital air. It would not be contained. The climax arrived not as an explosion, but as a stillness. The room did not swallow her. It listened. That was the surprise. Applause did not drown her out. Security did not move her aside. Instead, donors and board members sat with the discomfort, their eyes moving from Ethan's expensive suit to Claire's plain navy dress. They saw, perhaps for the first time, the gap between presentation and truth. Claire's heart pounded, but her breathing stayed even. Years of caring for her father had taught her how to steady trembling hands, how to wait out silence. Tonight she used the same patience on herself. She did not rush to fill the pause. She let it stretch, and in that stretch, her presence grew. Margaret Cole finally spoke. Her voice was measured, professional, but carrying a note of respect. "We will review all documentation," she said. "The board will expect to see full records tomorrow morning." It was not an endorsement, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. And for Claire, that was the first doorway opening. Ethan inclined his head slightly, his expression controlled but taut. He did not attempt to dismiss her. He simply turned the page of his notes, moving toward closure. Though everyone in the room understood, closure was not possible tonight. The story had already shifted. As the program ended, applause returned, but it was thin, uncertain, fragmented. Guests glanced toward Claire as they clapped, unsure whether they were applauding the company or the woman who had stood against it. Ethan shook hands with donors, his smile back in place, but a shade tighter than before. Claire gathered her folder, the same one she had carried quietly for weeks, and held it against her chest. Outside, the January wind knifed through the streets of Chicago. The city's towers gleamed, indifferent to the storm stirring inside one of them. Claire stepped into the night air feeling both lighter and more exposed than she had in years. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Inside, Margaret Cole convened quickly with the board. Tomorrow morning, a private review would take place. Claire's documents were requested. For her, sleep would be little more than a rumor. She knew the night ahead would be long, filled with papers spread across her kitchen table, her father's tea steaming beside them. But she also knew one thing with certainty: she had chosen visibility, and the world had listened. Power can admit it was wrong. When it does, the floor under everyone's feet moves a little. The morning after the gala, the boardroom felt colder than usual. Sunlight struck the glass walls with unforgiving clarity, and the long mahogany table seemed to stretch further than it had the night before. Claire sat at one end, her folder of documents neatly arranged before her. She had not slept, though her eyes were steady. Across from her, Ethan Harrington adjusted his cufflinks, his usual calm mask showing faint cracks. Margaret Cole presided from the center, her hands folded neatly, her gaze sharp. The air was heavy with what had not been said. Claire felt the press of silence, the weight of waiting. Then Ethan began to speak. His voice was lower than usual, less polished. He did not launch into defense or justification. Instead, he traced the shape of a pattern he had inherited. "I was raised in a world where leadership meant control," he admitted. "My father, and his father before him, believed credit should flow upward. Command was the structure. Recognition was assumed to belong to the name at the top." His words carried no theatrics, only the bluntness of confession. For the first time, Claire saw not the confident billionaire, but a man aware of his own habits, of the lineage that had shaped him. His shoulders sloped slightly, as if the act of admitting fault loosened something that had held him rigid for years. He looked directly at her. "I took what you built and made it mine. It was wrong." The floor seemed to tilt. Around the table, board members shifted. Margaret Cole's expression did not soften, but her eyes flicked toward Claire with a quiet acknowledgement. Ethan continued, "I propose immediate authorship credit for Neighbor's Table, back pay for intellectual property." And he paused, searching for words that did not come easily. "A formal role for Ms. Whitman to redesign how this company recognizes innovation, not as support, as origin." Claire's hands tightened around the edge of her folder. She had rehearsed anger, prepared herself for denial. What she heard instead unsettled her in a different way. Humility, from the man who had every advantage to crush her, felt almost unreal. Yet it was not polished humility. It was hesitant, imperfect, human. She let the silence stretch before she answered. When she spoke, her tone was as calm as it had been in the ballroom, but now it carried weight. "If this is to mean anything, it needs structure," she said. "I want formal acknowledgement of my authorship. My name attached to the program in every document, every presentation. Not as a footnote, but as fact." Ethan nodded. "Done." "I want authority across departments," she continued, her voice steady. "If recognition is to be rebuilt, it must not stop at philanthropy. It has to include research, operations, logistics, every corner where ideas are born. Again." He inclined his head. "Granted." Claire drew a slow breath. Quarterly cultural reports, presented to the board, with transparent metrics, not hidden in footnotes, visible. Margaret Cole's eyes flicked toward her, then toward Ethan. "That condition is essential," the chair said. Her voice carried finality. It will be part of the mandate. Claire added one last term, her voice softer but resolute. And if this does not work, I want a protective exit letter. A recommendation acknowledging my contributions accurately. No shadows. The boardroom was still. Ethan hesitated only a moment before he replied, "You will have it." Margaret straightened. "This board approves a 90-day pilot program. Claire Whitman will serve as Director of Recognition and Cultural Development. Oversight will be strict. Metrics will be transparent. If progress is not measurable, this ends." Her tone left no room for debate. The decision was made. A secretary who had once been invisible now held a mandate that could reshape the company. The shift was small in words, but enormous in meaning. Claire sat back in her chair, her folder still open, her documents neatly stacked. Relief did not flood her. Instead, she felt the quiet press of responsibility. She had been granted authority, but also placed under a magnifying glass. Every move she made would be measured. The work ahead would not be easy. It would be judged not only by numbers, but by names. Ethan glanced at her once more, and for the first time his expression carried no defense, no mask, only the unpolished look of someone trying to learn a new posture. "Thank you," he said simply. It was not enough to erase what had been done, but it was a start. When the meeting ended, board members filed out in silence, some thoughtful, others skeptical. Margaret lingered a moment, resting a hand lightly on Claire's shoulder. "You have 90 days, she said. "Use them well." Claire gathered her folder and walked out of the room. Her steps were measured, her dress plain, her hands still steady. Yet inside, she felt the ground had shifted, power had bent, not broken, and for the first time she carried not only evidence, but authority. That afternoon, she was given a small office. The window faced a side street rather than the lake. Her desk was bare, her team smaller than she had imagined, but the mandate was large. Her work would be measured in names, not numbers, and that, she knew, was the only measure that mattered. A corkboard went up in the hallway outside the break room. It was not pretty, it was not expensive. The frame was scratched, the thumbtacks mismatched, but people stopped to read it anyway. For the first time in memory, their names were written where everyone could see them, not on a schedule, not on a reprimand, on a board that said honor. Claire had started small. She knew that grand gestures could collapse under their own weight. The pilot program focused on 3 simple things: a monthly honor board where employees were recognized by name for their contributions, origin tags added to projects, so credit followed the idea from start to finish, and small grants for improvements proposed by staff themselves. It was not glamorous, but it was clear, and it was real. The first names pinned to the corkboard belonged to warehouse staff. One card read, Hank Lawson, proposed safer winter loading process. Hank had been driving long-haul trucks for more than 20 years. He knew the sting of icy ramps, the falls that left backs sore for weeks. He suggested inexpensive rubber mats and salt bins at every dock. Claire approved the grant immediately. By February, injury rates had fallen. People noticed. The board was not just decoration, it was evidence. Another card carried the name Jenny Pratt, piloted senior hour with rideshare partnerships. Jenny managed a small-town store in Indiana. She had noticed older customers struggling with both transportation and crowded aisles. She arranged a partnership with local rideshare drivers, then reserved an early morning hour just for seniors. The result was baskets filled higher, smiles warmer, and a sense of ease that spread across the community. When Claire visited the store, she saw an elderly man place his hand on Jenny's shoulder in thanks. That moment mattered more than any chart. In the warehouse, heat mitigation became another quiet success. Summer brought sweltering conditions that slowed workers and caused dangerous fatigue. A rotating schedule of short breaks, paired with simple cooling fans and hydration stations, changed the rhythm. Fewer people called in sick. Missed shifts declined. Claire tagged the origin on the board team recommendation. Implemented June. The credit belonged to many, not one. That was the point. Ethan Harrington joined the recognition tours himself. At first, Employees eyed him warily. They had seen executives visit before, usually in polished shoes that never touched the warehouse floor. But when Ethan arrived in steel-toe boots, carrying a notebook, the posture was different. He listened. He asked questions without cutting off answers. He leaned against pallets the way others did, shoulders less stiff than usual. Slowly, suspicion gave way to a tentative trust. Claire watched him on those visits. She noticed how he paused longer than necessary, how he wrote down names as if practicing a new habit. It was not the Ethan she had seen at the gala, smooth and untouchable. This was a man learning to stand in a room where power was not automatic. His transformation was uneven, but it was visible. Numbers began to shift, though they were never the first goal. Retention rates improved, absenteeism fell. Customer satisfaction nudged upward in towns where recognition programs touched store floors. For years, the company had measured efficiency in terms of profit margins and market share. Now, for the first time, kindness had metrics. The climax was not dramatic. It arrived in modest shapes, a ramp safer to walk on, a greeting warmer at the register, a schedule that no longer broke a body. The changes did not make headlines, but they rippled through lives. Hank's back ached less in the winter. Jenny saw familiar faces return each week. Warehouse workers finished shifts less exhausted. The board in the hallway grew crowded with names, and each name carried a story. Claire often stood by that corkboard in quiet moments, reading the cards as if they were chapters in a book. She thought of her mother's recipe cards, how handwriting had once turned into nourishment. These cards felt the same. They were recipes for dignity. Her heart carried both pride and caution. She knew success could attract resistance as quickly as praise. Her caution proved right. As metrics improved, as stories spread, attention came from outside. Competitors noticed. Analysts wrote about a culture experiment inside Harrington and Cole. Shareholders asked questions. Not all attention was friendly. The boardroom, once distant from these small victories, would soon be forced to confront them. For now, though, the hallway corkboard spoke louder than any press release. It was plain, it was honest, and it carried what people needed most: their own names. A number can feel like a storm. 22 billion looks like blue sky on paper and a siren in real life. The news arrived on a Monday morning, carried not by whispers, but by an official press release. Stonebridge Capital, a private equity giant with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, had launched a hostile bid to acquire Harrington and Cole. $22 billion, a figure so large it dominated every headline, every financial ticker crawling across television screens. The offer promised an immediate premium to shareholders, nearly impossible to ignore. On the surface, it looked like reward. Underneath, it sounded like warning. Within hours, analysts dissected the proposal. Stonebridge's plan was familiar: streamline operations, centralized decision-making, and trim inefficiencies. Everyone knew what that meant. Community stores with thin profit margins would close. Programs like Neighbor's Table would be labeled sentimental luxuries, unsustainable in quarterly reports. Jobs would vanish. The culture Claire and her small team had been building would be sold off like excess furniture in a clearance sale. The media framed the company's cultural work as an indulgence. Articles used words like costly, idealistic, unsustainable. Commentators called recognition programs soft and suggested that philanthropy was better handled by foundations, not businesses. The numbers, they argued, told a clearer story. Take the money now. Stonebridge had the capital. Harrington and Cole had the valuation. The equation looked simple. Inside headquarters, the storm broke louder. Phones rang without pause. Shareholders called demanding explanations. Emails stacked in inboxes. In one emergency meeting, CFO Thomas Riggs circled the phrase fiduciary duty in red ink across a printout. "We are obligated," he said firmly. "Our responsibility is to maximize shareholder value. Turning down this bid could be considered negligence." His words were sharp, but his eyes betrayed something colder: resignation. He had already decided which side of the storm he was on. Employees felt the tremors almost immediately. In the break rooms, whispers traveled faster than memos. Would their stores close? Would their jobs survive? Mortgage payments and college tuition hung in the air, unspoken but pressing. The corkboard in the hallway, once filled with names pinned proudly, suddenly felt fragile. People asked quietly if neighbors' table would be erased, if the work that had finally given them visibility would vanish with a signature. Claire walked those same hallways, listening more than speaking. She felt the fear ripple, saw the way shoulders hunched, how glances darted toward computer screens filled with headlines. She carried the weight of knowing that culture was not just an abstract idea. It was people's paychecks, people's dignity, people's futures. She refused to answer with slogans or empty reassurances. She knew words alone would not hold against $22 billion. That evening, Claire sat at her kitchen table, her father's tea steaming beside her. She spread out new papers, not drafts this time, but news clippings, shareholder letters, analyst predictions. The bid was not just financial, it was moral. The values they had rebuilt, credit flowing downward, names written clearly, dignity restored, were at risk of being reduced to overhead. She thought of Hank's safer ramps, Jenny's senior hour, the laughter she had heard in aisles once empty. Could all of that be undone by a single vote? Her heart tightened at the thought, but beneath the fear was resolve. If she had learned anything from standing up in that gala ballroom, it was this: truth needed more than defense. It needed evidence. It needed to stand in a boardroom and in a grocery aisle. She would not fight for culture as a slogan. She would fight for it as strategy, as survival. The next morning, she met with Ethan. His expression was taut, his usual polish stripped by the weight of what was at stake. "Stonebridge will call this culture sentimental," she said. "We have to show it's structural. We need data. We need stories. We need both." Ethan nodded slowly, his jaw tight. For once, he did not offer a quick fix. He simply asked, "Where do we start?" They began by gathering the evidence. Claire pulled metrics from the recognition program: injury rates down, retention up, sales rising in stores where employees felt seen. She collected testimonials, names, faces. She asked Jenny to describe what senior hour had done for her town. She called Hank and recorded his story about loading docks in winter. Every piece mattered. Numbers would carry weight in the boardroom. Stories would carry weight in people's hearts. The storm had only begun. Shareholder pressure was mounting. Stonebridge's representatives were already touring the media circuit, promising efficiency and growth. But Claire refused to be intimidated by numbers printed on glossy reports. She knew what $22 billion could buy. She also knew what it could destroy. As she prepared her folders late into the night, she steadied her breathing. She thought of her mother's recipe cards, of the corkboard crowded with names, of the voices that had trusted her enough to be written down. This was not just about saving a program. It was about proving that recognition was not overhead. It was the foundation. Sleep was scarce, but resolve was clear. The bid was more than financial. It was a test of what Harrington and Cole had become, and what it might still be. Claire knew the fight ahead would demand more than she had ever given. But she also knew this. She would not let values be sold off like scrap. She would carry them into the boardroom, steady as breath, ready for the storm. When numbers carry faces, they weigh differently in the hand. Claire knew the bid from Stonebridge could not be answered with emotion alone. Shareholders wanted returns, not slogans. But she also knew raw arithmetic would never capture the truth of what was happening inside the company. So, she began to shape a counter-strategy with Ethan, one that joined balance sheets to human stories, line graphs to names. They started with ownership. If loyalty anchors value, Claire said, then let employees own a piece of what they build. Together, they designed an employee ownership tranche. A modest percentage of shares would be reserved for staff across levels: warehouse workers, drivers, store managers, not stock options that vanished on paper, but real stakes, the kind of ownership that could not be erased by a quarterly shift. Ethan was cautious, but he saw the power of it. A workforce with skin in the game was harder for Stonebridge to dismiss as overhead. Next came community bonds. The idea was deceptively simple issue bonds dedicated to modernizing stores and food deserts. Investors could support growth while directly funding locations often deemed unprofitable. Cold chain improvements would be part of it. Better refrigeration systems to cut waste and boost margins for Midwest farmers supplying fresh produce. Each element was practical, measurable. Yet beneath the numbers was something deeper, a promise that dignity could also be strategy. Claire insisted on one more piece. "We need a recognition to ROI dashboard," she said, "not vague morale charts, hard data that links safety, retention, basket size, and customer satisfaction to specific staff ideas." Her team built it carefully, mapping every metric back to an origin tag on the corkboard. Injury rates fell after Hank's winter loading tweaks. Retention improved after warehouse cooling measures. Basket sizes grew after Jenny's senior hour program. Each statistic came with a name, a story. No one could call it sentimental when the evidence showed dollars following dignity. Investor roadshows became a test of rhythm. Ethan presented financials with practiced polish, but now Claire stood beside him. She carried folders of testimonies, photos of staff, quotes written in plain language. In one meeting, she read aloud a note from a driver who said recognition meant he could finally tell his son that his work mattered. The room of investors fell quiet, not out of pity, but because the note came paired with a chart showing reduced turnover costs, arithmetic and testimony hand in hand. Margaret Cole's role sharpened as the strategy grew. She was not indulgent. She demanded discipline. "This must outlast the quarter and the headline," she said firmly. "If it collapses in 6 months, Stonebridge will win on the second round." Her insistence forced Claire and Ethan to strip away anything ornamental. Every slide, every sentence had to prove endurance, not sentiment, structure. The work consumed weeks. Claire's apartment filled with drafts, sticky notes, coffee mugs left half empty. Her father watched her shuffle papers at the kitchen table night after night. Sometimes he reached out a trembling hand to steady a stack sliding toward the edge. His quiet gesture reminded her why this mattered. Recognition was not abstract. It was care. And care had to be built into the bones of the company if it was to survive. The climax of the preparation arrived not in a grand reveal, but in a shift of tone. Their plan was not a plea. It was not framed as saving culture for culture's sake. It was a business case rooted in dignity. When they rehearsed for the board, Claire spoke first. She laid out the link between names and numbers. When people are recognized, she said evenly, they stay longer, they think harder, they risk more. That risk becomes innovation. That innovation becomes profit. The chain is not sentimental, it is structural. For the first time, Ethan followed her rather than leading. He picked up where she left off, showing how projected margins outpaced Stonebridge's short-term premium when recognition was scaled company-wide. He spoke less like an heir and more like a partner. Margaret Cole nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging that something unusual was unfolding, humility paired with proof. Outside the boardroom, headlines continued to scream about $22 billion. Inside, a quieter truth was taking shape. Claire knew, however, that numbers alone would not carry the final vote. Investors would weigh the intangibles, trust, credibility, character. She could bring data and testimonies. But, in the end, they would also judge who she was, and who Ethan was becoming. As she packed her folder that night, she felt the same steadying breath she had practiced before the gala confrontation. The board vote was nearing. She had no illusions. It would be a storm. Yet she also knew storms were weathered by those who stood firm, carrying both evidence and truth. And she was ready. Some choices look like loss to the outside, and like breathing to the inside. The boardroom filled slowly, but the weight in the air arrived first. The Stonebridge bid still loomed like a shadow, $22 billion on paper. a siren that promised ease. Everyone knew rejecting it would draw criticism from analysts, possibly lawsuits from restless shareholders. But rejecting it might also be the only way to preserve what had been rebuilt in the last 90 days. Ethan Harrington was the first to speak. His suit was neat, but his words carried no polish. He announced that he would cap his own compensation for the next 3 years. Bonuses for all executives, including himself, would be tied directly to people metric safety improvements, retention, satisfaction scores. If the company failed to live up to its cultural commitments, leadership would feel the loss first. Then he went further. If governance requires it, he said plainly, I will step down. The statement cracked through the room. No one had expected the heir to offer his chair. Claire followed with conditions of her own. She laid out a proposal for transparent credit protocols, requiring every project, from pilot to rollout, to carry the names of contributors visibly. No more anonymous slides, no more work disappearing upward. She also pushed for a golden share charter, a binding rule that protected community commitments, including Neighbors' Table, from being dissolved by future takeovers. If we mean what we say, she told the board, it cannot depend on one leader's mood. It has to live in the bones of the company. Margaret Cole listened without expression. Then she left the numbers behind and went to see the stores herself. Without warning, she visited 3 pilot sites. In Indiana, she stood in the aisle during senior hour. She listened as older customers thanked Jenny Pratt by name. One woman, holding a basket of fresh apples, said she hadn't felt so comfortable shopping in years. In the warehouse, a driver showed Margaret the new mats on the ramps and said, fewer falls. I can work without worrying if I'll come home limping. At a checkout lane, a cashier told her she slept better now because her shifts were more predictable and her name was finally on the board in the hallway. Margaret returned to the boardroom, carrying more than spreadsheets. She carried voices. They were plain, but they were steady. When she recounted them aloud, the data shifted. It no longer read as abstract. It felt human. The climax came during the vote. Stonebridge's offer hung in front of every director like a gleaming exit sign. Hands rose slowly, tallying in favor of independence, then wavering toward sale. The count was close, closer than Claire had hoped. Then Margaret spoke again. We have seen numbers, she said. We have seen people. Tonight we must decide which measure will carry us further. Her words were not dramatic, but they were enough. The final votes tipped. The board rejected Stonebridge, by a margin that would look slim in headlines but felt enormous in the room. They chose to keep the company independent, not by clinging to sentiment, but by recognizing that lived experience, safer ramps, steadier schedules, warmer greetings was as much a business case as any premium offer. Relief did not arrive as applause. It came as exhalations, shoulders lowering, eyes closing briefly. For Claire, it arrived with the quiet knowledge that her mother's recipe cards would not be reduced to a footnote. For Ethan, it arrived as a reprieve paired with responsibility. His humility had been tested, and now it had to last beyond one meeting. Outside, analysts would call the decision reckless. Shareholders would question it. The market would react with suspicion. But inside, the air was different. It was lighter, as if the company itself had taken its first full breath in years. Claire packed her folders slowly. The hard part was not over. If anything, it had only begun. Now the promises would have to pay for themselves in daylight. Every name pinned to the corkboard, every metric on the dashboard, every voice recorded in a testimony would be held up against the choice the board had just made. It was not the easier yes, but it was the one that made breathing possible. Victory is not a headline. It is a week without accidents. It is a neighbor who returns because she was seen. 6 months passed after the board vote. The frenzy of headlines had faded. Analysts had moved on to other stories, other valuations. Inside Harrington and Cole, the proof of choice was not written in newspapers. It was written in routines. Revenue lifted not spectacularly, but steadily. Stores that had been on the margin saw baskets grow heavier. Customers lingered longer. Turnover dropped across warehouses. The same names appeared on schedules month after month. Stability settling in like good soil. Insurance premiums eased as safety incidents declined. Numbers moved, not because of slogans, but because fewer backs were strained, fewer ankles twisted, fewer shifts abandoned in exhaustion. Neighbors' table expanded cautiously, then confidently. More towns received deliveries. More church basements filled with fresh produce. On every piece of program material, Claire's mother's name appeared in small, steady type. Inspired by the community work of Margaret Whitman, it was not a flourish, it was a fact. For Claire, seeing that name in print was both wound and healing. Her mother's pantry cards had finally become public truth. Hank Lawson logged proud miles on safer routes. His truck carried not only goods, but a sense of dignity. At rest stops, he told other drivers about the mats at the docks and how a simple change had cut winter injuries. He spoke with quiet pride, the kind that builds without fanfare. Jenny Pratt mentored a younger manager, teaching her not only how to read inventory, but how to read people. "Watch the seniors," she said gently. "See how they hold their baskets. That tells you more than the numbers do." Warehouse teams refined practices week by week. Cooling stations grew smarter, schedules fairer. Incidents that once seemed inevitable became rare. In morning huddles, supervisors named contributors aloud. This was Lisa's idea. This was Jorge's fix. The corkboard filled so quickly that Claire had to order a second one. She did not mind. Seeing the cards pinned in rows felt like seeing chapters of a book being written by many hands. Ethan's posture changed, too. He no longer swept through hallways as if time itself bent around him. He paused now, greeting by name, not all names, not yet, but more than anyone expected. He asked questions in warehouses without rushing to offer solutions. He learned to listen, and people noticed. It softened the edges of his authority. The company began to look less like him and more like the people who worked there. The climax of these months was not a shock. It was a deep breath. Proof came in small increments, accident-free weeks. Employees staying through seasons. Customers smiling at familiar cashiers. It was not sentimental. It was measurable, and it was visible. Charts showed the rise. Faces showed the meaning. For Claire, the rhythm of work remained demanding. She traveled often, visiting stores, warehouses, meetings with community partners. Yet, beneath the long days was a steadiness she had never known. When she returned home at night, she sat again at her kitchen table with her father's tea steaming beside her. Papers still spread across the surface. But they told a different story now. They were not evidence for defense. They were plans for growth. Sometimes her father asked her to read the recognition board updates aloud. His hands shook too much to hold the printout steadily. She read each name slowly, letting him hear the chorus of contributors. "This is what your mother would have wanted," he said more than once. Claire believed him. Stability carried a quiet gift reflection. The storm of the bid was over. The fight for visibility had shifted into the work of sustaining it. Healing asked to be named, too. And so, Claire began to think less about defense and more about legacy. What would it mean to keep these practices alive beyond her, beyond Ethan, beyond even Margaret Cole's oversight? The question lingered like an open door. Victory was not in the headlines. It was in the everyday. And the everyday was finally becoming enough. After a storm, the house still stands. But the rooms feel new. People speak differently inside them. For Claire, the months after the Stonebridge fight carried a quieter rhythm. Her work remained heavy, but steadier. Colleagues who once treated her as the woman behind the calendar now saw her as a peer. Some stopped by her small office not for scheduling, but for counsel. A warehouse lead came in one afternoon just to say thank you for listening, for naming his idea in a meeting. A young manager asked her to review a proposal, not because she had to, but because he trusted her eye. Respect arrived not in speeches, but in these small requests. At home, caregiving no longer felt like a solitary weight. Claire's father, though still struggling with Parkinson's, found small ways to give back. He folded laundry slowly, carefully. He insisted on making her tea when she returned late from trips. Neighbors checked in, bringing casseroles, offering rides. Claire's colleagues sometimes sent groceries or stopped by to carry boxes upstairs. What had once been invisible labor now felt supported, shared. Ethan Harrington, too, was changing. One morning, the company inboxes pinged with a message from him. It was longer than his usual announcements, written without the polish of a communications team. He named past harms plainly: the culture of upward credit, the invisibility of staff contributions, the silence that had passed for efficiency. He wrote about inheritance, about the command and control mindset handed down through his family. Then he wrote about choice. "We do not inherit only wealth," he said. "We inherit patterns, and we decide which ones to carry forward." Employees read the letter slowly, some twice. It was not a grand rebranding. It was not a glossy brochure. It was a confession wrapped in a commitment. Ethan ended with a line that struck more deeply than he perhaps realized. Recognition is not charity. It is justice. The moral center of the company began to sharpen. Prosperity without dignity now looked hollow, a kind of poverty dressed in numbers. The honor boards, the origin tags, the small grants, all of them gained new weight after Ethan's letter. They were not just programs. They were acknowledgments that people's names had always belonged at the heart of the story. The twist, if it could be called that, was quiet. Apology became policy. Policy became habit. And habit, carried long enough, began to look like culture. Meetings started with attributions. Reports listed contributors by name. Successes were tied to the people who had thought them, built them, tested them. Over time, what had once been remarkable became expected. Claire watched this shift with a mixture of relief and tenderness. She remembered the night of the gala, how her voice had trembled against silence. She remembered laying out her documents by her father's tea, unsure if anyone would listen. Now she saw those documents echoed in systems, in dashboards, in the daily rhythm of recognition. It was not perfect. Nothing lasting ever was. But it was steady. Margaret Cole remained vigilant, watching with her practiced gaze. She insisted that reports be public, that oversight stay firm. Yet even she allowed herself a smile in one meeting when an employee's suggestion was presented with full credit. She leaned toward Claire and whispered, "This is what survival looks like." The company, once shaken by fear of takeover, now found itself looking outward again. Communities noticed. Local papers covered neighbors' table, expansions with photos of children holding fresh produce. Farmers wrote letters of thanks for contracts that made their work viable. Seniors sent handwritten notes about mornings when the store felt welcoming, safe. Each note, pinned on Claire's corkboard, reminded her that recognition stretched far beyond walls of glass offices. Toward the end of that season, the company began planning a community celebration, not a gala, not chandeliers or live streams. A table, long enough for neighbors, set in a small town store. The kind of table Claire's mother would have set, with casseroles and pies, with mismatched chairs and laughter filling the gaps. It would not be for investors. It would be for the people whose names had built the proof. Claire felt a lump in her throat when the idea was proposed. She thought of her mother's pantry, of recipe cards that had started this journey. The thought of neighbors gathering at a table because her mother believed food was dignity. It felt like the circle closing in, a way she had never dared hope. The storm had passed. The house still stood. But the rooms were different now. People spoke with more care inside them. Recognition had found its rightful place, not as decoration, but as foundation. And in that foundation, Claire sensed healing not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been unseen. A long table turned a grocery store aisle into a gathering. Folding chairs lined the space where shoppers usually pushed carts. Paper name cards lay neatly in front of each plate. Steam rose from pans filled with casseroles and stews, carried in by employees and neighbors alike. The best plans, Claire thought, always tasted like something. This was not a gala. There were no cameras flashing, no tuxedos or gowns, just a small town store, one of the first pilot sites for Neighbor's Table, dressed in warmth. Fluorescent lights softened with strings of paper lanterns. The sound system, usually playing announcements, now carried soft music. The scent of baked bread and spiced apples filled the air, more powerful than any corporate slogan. Seniors were seated first. Jenny Pratt herself walked them down the aisle, steadying arms, pulling out chairs. A farmer who had supplied apples for the program carried in a basket and placed it at the center of the table. A warehouse worker ladled soup into bowls with hands more used to lifting pallets. Each act carried dignity. Before the meal, names were spoken aloud. Margaret Cole stood with her usual measured presence, but her voice sounded different now, warmer, fuller. She thanked workers not only by job title but by name. Hank Lawson for safer ramps, Jenny Pratt for senior hour, Lisa Martinez for heat rotation schedules. One by one, names filled the air like blessings. People clapped, not in polite bursts, but in rhythms of recognition that felt earned. Claire sat quietly, her father beside her. His hands trembled as he lifted a spoon, but his eyes shone. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single card from her mother's old recipe box. The handwriting, slightly faded, still carried the loops and flourishes she had memorized as a child. She placed the card near the center dish, a casserole, not unlike the ones her mother had once carried to church basements. The sight of it, resting there among steaming pans, brought a lump to her throat. Ethan stood when it was his turn to speak. He did not use slides. He did not hide behind figures. He thanked the origin openly. Neighbor's table began at Claire Whitman's kitchen table. He said, "It began with a daughter honoring her mother's work, and it grew because people here carried it forward." His voice faltered for a moment, then steadied. "Tonight, we eat together because recognition lives here now." For Claire, hearing those words was not triumph, it was relief. The applause that followed was not for spectacle, but for something more grounded, a culture where names stayed attached to the work they had built. As dishes were passed and plates filled, conversation flowed. A driver told a senior about the new safety mats. A cashier shared a laugh with a farmer about produce that once spoiled too quickly, but now arrived fresher. A young manager leaned close to Jenny, asking how she had organized senior hour so smoothly. Knowledge passed in murmurs, like recipes between generations. The program, Claire realized, was no longer fragile. It had outgrown her folder of documents. It belonged to the community now, carried in voices, remembered in meals, practiced in routines. The company had provided structure. The people had given it life. There was no twist to the evening, only a promise. The table would be set again next month, and the month after, in towns across the Midwest. That was the point. Not one celebration, but a habit. Not a spectacle, but a rhythm. Recognition that endured because it was woven into the everyday. As plates emptied and chairs scraped back, Claire looked around the aisle transformed. She thought of her mother's pantry, of the quiet courage it had taken to stand in the gala months before, of the corkboard filled with names. The journey had been long, marked by storms and near losses. Yet it had led here to neighbors eating together, to names spoken out loud, to a culture that finally understood itself. Before leaving, Claire stood for a moment by the long table. She traced her fingers over her mother's recipe card, then tucked it back into her bag. Her heart was steady, her breath even, healing, she realized, was not loud. It was in nights like this, when dignity was shared as naturally as food. For those listening now, perhaps far from this small town store, there is a place for you at this table too. Think of a moment when recognition changed your day, your home, your workplace. Recall it, share it, keep the table long. The story of Claire Whitman is not only about a stolen idea or a corporate battle, it is about the courage to step out of silence and insist that dignity matters. For many of us, especially as we grow older, we know how easy it is to be overlooked, our efforts taken for granted, our names forgotten while others are praised. But Claire's journey reminds us that recognition is not vanity, it is justice. True prosperity is never just measured in dollars. It is measured in the lives we touch, the names we honor, and the communities we strengthen. When Ethan chose humility, when the board chose values over a quick profit, They showed that even powerful systems can change when someone dares to tell the truth in our own lives. The lesson is simple but profound. Do not underestimate the weight of your voice. Whether in a family, a workplace, or a neighborhood, naming contributions and giving credit changes the air we breathe. Justice often begins not in courtrooms, but in kitchens, in offices, and in the courage of one person who says, "This was mine, and it matters." Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us through this story. If Claire's journey touched your heart, we invite you to keep the spirit alive. Please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that shine a light on courage, dignity, and hope. Your support helps us keep the table long and the stories flowing.